The muscle mass differences between males and females is on average actually around 40%, which is a very big difference. One important objective for many sports organizations is to be inclusive towards trans people. But they also want to maintain fair and safe competition, and some sports have valued these two core objectives slightly differently. There was also a coach of Khalif saying the other day that yes, he confirmed that yes, they did find out about the XY chromosomes last year. They did find out about high testosterone levels. And he also claimed that Khalif was now on testosterone suppression. So all of these facts together kind of indicates that these are athletes with XY chromosomes. They are biologically male because they have high testosterone levels as well, as confirmed by the coach.
People are plastic. We're plastic beings in pretty much every way, but literally. Our morphologies change, our physiologies change, our psychologies change, our sense of self changes. And yet, at the same time, we seem to innately recognize limitations in people's plasticity, perhaps most obviously in the fact that we categorize people as either male or female. And this categorisation seems to imply restrictions on how much people can change, how much we can perceive that they can change. But those restrictions are fuzzy. What is it to perceive someone as male or as female? In terms of how they act, what they look like, perhaps even what they can do. This raises the perhaps fashionable question, in a truly liberal society, should there be any limits on who is male and who is female? But then again, the objective and therefore dispassionate science of biology is very clear about the definitions of male and female. Not just in humans, but across the animal kingdom, males are defined as those individuals that produce the male gamete, that is sperm, or at least have the anatomy designed to produce the male gamete, even if it doesn't work. Likewise, females produce the female gamete, eggs. Certain viewpoints in liberal society contrasting with the tenets of biology create tensions around sex and gender, fairness and opportunity, scientific fact and human rights. Recently, these tensions were on full display at the Paris Olympics, where there was, and indeed still is, ongoing debate about, in particular, two boxers who fought in the female categories, both who have gone on to win gold in different weight categories. They're Imani Khalif and Lin Yuting. There's contention in terms of whether they should have been banned from ever even entering those competitions, or shouldn't have been banned. Dr. Tommy Lundberg is an exercise physiologist with an expertise in the physiological development of male and female athletes. He's been talking to the press an awful lot recently about controversies at these Olympics. I'm going to chat with him today about these arguably complex, certainly contentious issues around gender, sex, society, Olympic boxing, and whether biologically we can always know whether someone is male or female. Tommy, thank you so much for giving up your evidently extremely precious time to chat with me today. I'm genuinely flattered. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be looking down at my notes quite a lot, because I want to walk through, the conversation can go where it goes, obviously, but I also want to go through in a logical fashion a number of questions that I want to ask and other people have asked me to ask about all this business. Fascinating and tricky topics. So given that, you know, the Olympics has, well, I suppose it officially finished Sunday night. I think the closing ceremony was Sunday night, so 36 hours ago. So we'll start off with that. So in the majority of Olympic sports, we have two categories of competition. Okay, one is males and one is for females. Now, perhaps this is obvious, or maybe it's not when we dig into it. Why is there this separation between males and females? Well, and slightly less obvious, why is that separation not universal across all Olympic sports?
Yeah, I think it's, thanks first of all for having me. I think this is a great initiative. I think it's important to remind ourselves why we have sports categories. Sex categories are obvious ones that most people know about, but we also have sometimes age categories in youth sport and also master athletes. We have also categories dependent on how your body functions. So there will be Paralympics coming soon. And in some sports, even like boxing, we have also weight classes. And the idea with categorization in sport is, I think it's important to remember that it's probably the most inclusive effort we can make for everyone to be able to join competitive and meaningful sport. Because if there were no categories, almost all the medals at the Olympics now would have gone to male athletes that are probably between 20 and 30 years or so, with some exceptions, of course. But we have many other groups of people who want to take part in sport. And these basic categories, they are the idea with them is to control for certain advantages that are so large, so those people who lack these advantages, they cannot compete fairly and meaningfully against those who have these advantages. And, which is important, they are also advantages that has really nothing to do with talent or exceptional attributes. So the male typical performance advantage is really the basis of why we need a protected female category, because females lack the male typical development during puberty that gives these large advantages in muscle mass, body size, endurance capacity. And we should not reward being male more than being female in sport. So in order to give these medals to females, they need a separate category because they are so disadvantaged in their physical attributes compared with the average male.
Are there Olympic sports where there aren't male and female categories? And if so, why?
Yeah, there are a few events. I think some of the horse events are without categories, for example. There might be a few more. I think it goes down to do we need a separate protected category for females or not? And one of the key questions to ask then is, of course, are there any key performance differences, the average performance differences, or if you compare the best versus the best, how large are there any differences between sex, or can we compete both safely, fairly, and meaningfully with mixed sports? And I think and it may also to some extent go back to the history of sport. How was the sport created to begin with? How did we compete? Some sports, of course, were mainly or only males in the beginning. So some of these things may change as well over time, but really the basis of the categorization, male and female, it has to do with large performance differences on average. And if there is little to no difference, then of course the need for a separate category is much smaller, and sometimes we don't need to separate between sexes.
It makes sense, perhaps. I mean, I don't know a lot about equestrian, so horse-based sport, but it perhaps makes sense that there isn't an advantage for either of the sexes in terms of working with a horse to jump barriers and so forth. But I think there are still sex categories for kind of the shooting events. Clay pigeon shooting, was it, and pistols and things. Again, I don't know a lot about those. It's not obvious to me there would be an advantage for one of the sexes there, but maybe, and I'm not saying it's justified or not, but maybe the explanation is historical.
Yes, it can be historical. I do think that there is, I read one report saying that there was like between 1% and 2% average performance difference. It's sometimes difficult to say whether it's only due to biological differences or whether it's sort of more relates to social differences in participation rates, for example, in the sport, because obviously if there are more males in a sport, that will also to some extent affect how good the best athletes are, etc. But the key point is, of course, that yes, there are sports that rely less on physique, and those sports, the sex differences are much smaller. But sometimes, I think also that sports sometimes have these categories to be maximally inclusive against girls, and want to have as many men and women compete in the sport. And sometimes sex categories may play a part just in reaching that objective as well.
Yes, you could do. I mean, at the end, you do have more winners if you have more categories. And
Yeah.
very simply put, maybe there's some good in that. More people get a chance to be a winner. Yeah. I'm not aware. I hope no one gets annoyed with me saying this. I'm not aware of any sports where women are known to have an advantage. It seems, although we're not, I don't think we're going to get into this today, but although we know that on the average, women have some cognitive advantages over men, they're often better in terms of language ability and long-term memory or spatial memory, for example. That doesn't seem to equate to advantages in any of the sports, at least at the Olympics. In other words, there don't seem to be any sports where women have an innate advantage over men.
No, there's been, I think there's one of the, I may be wrong, but this is what I've heard, that one of the events in gymnastics, one of the disciplines in gymnastics, there's an advantage for girls, but the men don't have that discipline. I don't know what the English word is for it, but it's one of the disciplines where you do stuff on this bar, basically.
High beam. Well, that,
yeah, maybe
something where they're flipping around and landing, and doing backflips and stuff on the bar.
Yeah, exactly. On a thin bar. Yeah.
And those guys just don't do it.
Yeah, exactly. So then the guys don't do it. But yeah, in most sports, certainly there are this male performance advantage. It varies depending on the sport, how large it is, and in some sports, obviously, where there are very little differences, there is also very little advantage. Yes.
I mean, personally, I quite like it when men and women or boys and girls can do it together. I think that's nice. But on the other hand, as you said, and then there's one less medal or less medals to go around if you have them all together. So there are some interesting trade-offs there. And of course, most of the time, there is evidently a difference in capability on average between the sexes. Okay, so typically in sports, men have some degree of advantage, not always. There may be a few sports where it's the reverse, but this is less clear. But typically men have advantage, and it's broadly speaking to do with the fact, well, most obviously that they're bigger and stronger. Slightly less obvious, but I think it's the case that men in their prime, perhaps on average, have slightly faster reaction speeds, maybe slightly better coordination. And of course, there's plenty of people of both sexes who are wonderfully coordinated and not so wonderfully coordinated. But when you're looking at the top end, why do men have these advantages? What's the biology behind it?
Yeah, so these performance differences can really be sort of pinned down to key biological differences, and the body size is one of the most obvious factor. Men get taller and bigger. Men also have, in terms of sports, a more favorable body composition. So more of the body consists of muscle, especially in the upper body. So the muscle mass differences between males and females is on average actually around 40%, which is a very big difference. And in some sports, the height alone is an advantage. A greater wingspan can be an advantage. But men also have larger heart and lung sizes. Men have therefore also a higher blood volume, which leads to higher maximal aerobic capacity on average. So and then there are some differences that maybe are smaller or more nuanced, like you mentioned yourself, visual, spatial ability, etc. But most of the explanation can really come from these basic factors in terms of body size, and these really diverge between sexes during puberty with the effects of the sex hormones.
Okay, well, sex hormones or hormone. I mean, what I'd like to get to here is there's a very heavy focus on testosterone, and understandably, Is that the master key here? Is that the difference?
Yes, I think we don't have to simplify too much to say with a high degree of accuracy that it's largely due to testosterone. There are sort of genetic sex differences as well that may play a part, and there's some studies, for example, showing that even if you suppress testosterone during puberty, you still kind of reach the predicted height that you would reach based on your genetic natal sex. So there are probably some of these differences that are more genetic in origin, but a large part of them certainly comes from this large surge of testosterone that we know happened during puberty, where males have 15 to 20 times higher testosterone levels than girls.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So the difference in testosterone levels between the sexes is extreme. I would say extreme.
Yeah.
So I think I want to make that clear. However, and I think this is important, I think we'll come back to this. So I don't want to put words into your mouth, but to try and summarize perhaps what you said and tell me if I've got this wrong. Testosterone is the big player here. The fact that males during puberty and beyond, but during puberty, have a lot of testosterone relative to females. They've also got the receptors to accept that testosterone and respond to it. And that is the big difference. That is the mechanism that drives large differences in physical development between males and females. And for the sake of this conversation, give males sort of physical advantages that often are represented in sport. However, and this is very important, males that don't generate a lot of testosterone, young males that don't generate a lot of testosterone, or otherwise their body is non-responsive to it. So they produce it, but the body does nothing with it. Your point is that they would still typically have some degree of physical advantage by the end of puberty than do females. It would be much less, maybe a smallish fraction, but there'd still be some difference. So it's not just testosterone.
Yes, exactly. If you go into the sort of more nuances, there seems to be, high body height, for example, seems to be quite genetically driven as well, and there are some differences also evident before puberty. So even at birth, actually, when you analyze boys and girls with MRI or CT or DEXA scans, you can see that they actually have slightly more lean body mass already at birth. So some of these differences may be present before puberty. But most of them happen during puberty, driven by testosterone. But some of them may also be related to more genetically driven differences.
Okay, and that's very, very important. And I think we'll probably come back to that. I thought I'd quickly look online to see if I could find results for boys and girls before puberty, like athletic results, to compare them. Now, there's caveats that I'll come to, and it's not easy to find quickly anyway, but British under 13 records for some athletic events. I just randomly selected a few. I won't go through them in detail. So for 60 meters, the British record, apparently, at least until recently, for girls was 8.15 seconds, which is a very rapid 60 meters. And for the boys, it was 8.05, so a tenth of a second quicker. So not a lot, but obviously that can be the difference between gold and silver or whatever. For 400 meters, it was for the girls 63. So imagine a 12-year-old girl running around the athletics track in 63.6 seconds. It's not bad going. A boy, presumably 12, running around in 58.1 seconds. I mean, wow. 1500 meters, a slightly different event because obviously it's more stamina based. Girls, I mean, this is remarkable. 1500 meters, 4:37 at 12 years of age, and boys 4:18. So quite a difference. However, first of all, some children at 13 have started puberty, and in fact, the ones that have the records probably are into puberty, which partly explains why they're the best at that age group. And secondly, and you mentioned this earlier, I think there are considerably more males, boys in this case, than girls doing athletics. And so everything else being equal, you'd expect the very, very top end results to be better for boys than girls because you've just got more people to play with. Now, I've got some more here. I'm not going to go on about this, but I kind of thought it was an interesting way to look at these things. So then I found 8 and under, right? So they definitely not started puberty. No one, I don't think basically anyone has at that age, or so few as to not count. Right. So 8 and under, boys 13, and this may not be Britain, sorry, but it doesn't really matter. I think it's comparable. 13.69 seconds for 100 meters versus the girls 14.07. And I'll do one more. 400 meters, 103.3 for the boys and 106.5 for the girls. So that cuts out puberty, I think. But on the other hand, again, you might just have more boys doing it than girls. So perhaps, so I guess there isn't a way to look at records of prepubescent children and decide if at those prepubescent ages, boys or indeed girls have an advantage, because you can't control for participant number, I guess is the rub of that.
Yeah, it's true that it's sometimes difficult to know how much of these considerably smaller differences before puberty, whether they are due to participation rates, culture, history, social factors, physical activity, etc., or biological factors, or probably, I believe, a combination, because as I said, for example, body fat percentage, lean body mass slightly favors still boys before puberty. And there are also some interesting differences in the magnitude of so in swimming the sex difference before puberty is very small, maybe 1% or 2%. In athletics it's between 2 and 5%, but in throwing the difference is quite large, 2 standard deviation difference already at when kids are around 3-4 years. There's one report from the 80s suggesting so that's also interesting, that it's really it's less consistent, and it may vary depending on the discipline.
Let's flip this. So we've talked about males and testosterone or not testosterone. I'm old enough to just about remember an inordinate number of Eastern Europeans, as we sort of term them, Eastern European women winning on the athletics track, in the swimming pool. And I think it was known at the time, it's certainly known now, that sadly for them, actually, as much as anything, many of them, if not all of them, were pumped up on testosterone. And this evidently, in fact, I saw the 4x400 meter women's final in the Olympics the other day. The Americans won by a very long way with an extraordinary good quartet. They still didn't break the world record, which is held by not Americans or Jamaicans or whatever it is, but by Russians. Okay, so maybe the Russians were particularly good at, but it suggests that there were things going on behind the scenes. However, so we've talked about testosterone during puberty, but presumably for some of these athletes, female athletes who were cheating, the system required them to, I think, presumably some of them were not getting testosterone until they were adults. Although maybe I'm wrong about that. I mean, if one gives a female testosterone post puberty, does that do anything for them?
Yes, so it does improve performance. It cannot be really compared with sort of male testosterone-driven development during puberty. You wouldn't, even if women would use testosterone as doping in adulthood, they wouldn't reach on average male levels, but they would still see a performance enhancing effect. And that's what we saw during these doped events, East Germans, etc., during the 80s. And there is scientific studies as well showing that there is, this dose-dependent increase in muscle mass, etc., with different levels of testosterone, and especially if you combine it with resistance training. So yeah, you get a positive effect. That's one of the reasons why it's banned and classified as doping. But it cannot really be compared either with male development during puberty, I think.
So to be clear then, so the effect of testosterone is not just during puberty, but it's post puberty.
Yes, exactly. And when you take it from the outside, the exogenous administration, it's doping, and it does improve performance. Yes.
So let's flip it again. So as post-pubescent women, fully adult, let's say women who take testosterone can have an advantage, particularly if they promote muscle growth through lifting weights at the same time.
Yeah.
Also, it's the case that males who, I don't know, take a testosterone suppressant uh, will exhibit probably some decrease in their physical capacity.
Yes. So that has been studied both in terms of transgender women who undergo testosterone suppression and estrogen replacement therapy, but also in slightly older men who have prostate cancer and undergo complete androgen deprivation therapy. So, and that has been relatively well quantified. So in trans women, there are probably 12 longitudinal studies measuring muscle mass changes after 1 year of testosterone suppression, and it decreases muscle mass by approximately 4 to 5%.
Right. Okay. So there are effects there. Right. Given that there are these clear effects of testosterone, most notably during puberty, but also post-puberty, why is it that in the last few years we've been seeing clearly, how can I put this, known to be biological males in female sporting competitions? Now, let's just be clear here. I'm talking about that now. The modern phrase, I think, is trans female athletes. So males that have, in inverted commas, perhaps transitioned to female. I think the example in the previous Olympics, so the Tokyo Olympics, I think, and you mentioned it earlier, that there was at least one. I think Hubbard was the name of a New Zealand athlete who was in weightlifting,
Yeah.
who was a transgender, let's say, or athlete.
Mm.
So they were a male who was competing in the female category. So this is a jump, if you like, from the biological to the social, but of course they're linked. And I appreciate I'm asking kind of a quite big question here, but why was that allowed, given what we understand about the testosterone advantages for males?
Yeah, that's a very relevant question, and it's a question that is heavily, of course, discussed today in sports, and also has been for a couple of years. So my view, based on what we know from the science, is kind of like we indicated before, that if you have undergone male development, male puberty, you have a long-lasting effect from that. And testosterone suppression, which some sports still rely on in terms of eligibility criteria, that you should suppress your testosterone levels down to female levels for 1 year. Some sports now have 2 years. It's not doing enough to mitigate or remove. It doesn't remove these advantages. So from a fair competition point of view, I think it is unfair to compete with this male performance advantage. But of course, if you look at it more broadly, of course, the reason why it still is allowed in some sports is that the sports really struggle between these two objectives. One objective, important objective for many sports organizations, is to be inclusive towards trans people. But they also want to maintain fair and safe competition. And some sports have valued these two core objectives slightly differently. But I also do think that some sports have sort of misjudged biology and scientific evidence as well. So it's interesting that we're seeing still different solutions to this dilemma.
Yeah, so different sports are in different situations at the moment with how they're dealing with these issues. And obviously, yes, we live in a modern culture where we want to be inclusive and allow people to do things rather than stopping them doing things. And so we get this clash. There is again, for somebody of my age, there's this bizarre parallel between whatever it would be 30, 40 years ago, when some women were being given testosterone to enhance them and make them more masculine in effect. Whereas now, in some cases, they're not doing that. They're simply bringing in men who already have their own innate levels of testosterone and categorizing them as female. I mean, there are, of course, some parallels there and some differences, but it's extraordinary sort of 30, 40 years on that we're in this position.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to a related situation and bringing it more towards well, we'll get there in the end, the Olympic boxers. So we've got female registered athletes who, and I think this is right, but this is where I really need your guidance. So female registered athletes who are not sort of, I would say, known to be male, but are reporting as transgender, but female registered athletes whose sex is not easily determined. That's a rather general statement. And right, so we have this situation where we have people reporting to be female, and their sex is not easily determined. Maybe relatively invasive assessments would determine that they're male. How is it the case, first of all, so biologically, that some people that their sex is not evident, is not clear?
Yeah, so that's one of the sex/gender issues in sport, together with the transgender athlete issue, like you mentioned. Now, in terms of sex development, we have a clear body plan based on your genetic setup and your chromosomes. So if you have XY chromosomes, your genetic sex is male, and the body plan is to basically produce testicles, etc. Whereas if you have a XX female body plan, the intended development is uterus, etc. And to produce and support the larger gamete, the egg. So really, all sex is binary in the concept that you either have the anatomy, reproductive system, and physiology that supports the sperm, or you have the system that supports the egg. So that's the definition of sex. But in some cases, there are disorders or differences in sex development, where sometimes, for example, external genitalia may be not easily recognized as either sex, or it may be ambiguous. So in some of these cases that we know have happened in athletics before, there are male athletes who have been identified as girls because their external genitalia have not developed. So they have been, you can say, mistaken for girls. And sometimes this is not noticed until puberty in some cases. So it is true that there may be some conflict between the development of the sex glands and organs, etc. But most of these differences of sex development, they can easily be classified being male or female in their origin.
How is it so? Okay, so all right. So you're saying that you could do a swab test or a blood test, something relatively non-invasive, arguably not very invasive at all, to assess their chromosome makeup and to determine whether they are XY or XXXX female, XY male. And right, so I don't know whether this is answerable. So as we've both mentioned, males are ultimately defined by having, as you say, the body plan to produce sperm. You know, it doesn't always work, but they've got the body plan to produce sperm. Like a car might break down, but it's still a car. Females have the body plan to produce eggs. Is it possible ever, at least in the human being, for someone to have, let's say, for example, an XY sex chromosome, so the male sex chromosome, and yet produce eggs?
It's a good question. I have seen now on X or social media one extreme case report circulating where that actually happened. But generally, if you have XY, your body produces testicles, and sometimes with high normal male testosterone levels and functioning testosterone, sometimes not. Sometimes you are androgen insensitive, which means that your body will still develop more female typical, even if you actually have some some aspects of testicles, but sometimes there is ambiguity in the sex glands as well. But I don't think anyone can be producing functioning gamete types of the opposite sex if you have XY, XX, with the small caveat that I've seen this case report circulating that I'm not really trained to fully judge that situation, but certainly there are several, of course, of these differences of sex development where you unfortunately are infertile because of these disorders of sex development. But almost all of them, you can still classify them quite easily if it's a male one or a female one, depending on the body plan.
Yeah, again, it comes back to this key point. They may not produce eggs or they may not produce sperm, but they've got the body plan to do it. Again, like a car might.
Exactly.
I mean, actually, my car yesterday wasn't working because the battery was flat, but it was still a car. And okay, so to within a nanometer of perfection, if someone has XY chromosomes, they are male, and if they have an XX sex chromosome, they are female. There's just a possibility that there's one case study on X that we might want to look at, but I mean, it can't be validated.
Yeah, another exception is, I know that there's one condition where you have XX, but you have this S or Y gene material present still, which is the sort of male-making gene. So there is one, I think, one XX condition where you actually have a more male-typical development as well.
Right. So let me put this, because this is the nub of it. So I think for a lot of people, they would be asking questions such as, can we definitely determine everybody's sex? Are sex chromosomes a perfect determination of sex, which we've talked about? I'm going to check my notes here because I want to, as I say, I want to cover all these. Can a person ever be deemed to be both male and female, or can a person ever be deemed to be neither male or female?
I mean, my answer to that would be no in both cases. I think with some of the cases can be complex and require further testing, but you can certainly not be both male and female in any sort of strict biological sense. And I think the term intersex, by the way, is kind of getting outdated now as well, because of this fact that you're not between sexes just because your development hasn't functioned 100% like the typical cases. So yeah, there's some misunderstandings, I think, generally around these DSD cases. It's a disorder of sex development, but it doesn't take away the general fact that you're either male or female.
Just to keep pushing this a little bit more, and I appreciate that, it gets into murky waters where we can't, and we can very rarely say definitely 100%. Is it possible to say that someone doesn't have the body to produce either? I mean, if the formation of the body is affected enough that they don't really produce either set of sexual morphologies, that they're not set up to produce either sperm or gametes, and therefore could be deemed to be neither of those sexes?
Yeah, I think Swyer syndrome is one where you need support with exogenous sex hormones, etc., to develop fully as either male or female, because your sex glands are very underdeveloped. That's my understanding of those cases. So you don't really produce any of the gametes clearly. But we are closing in now on my threshold of competence. There are certainly endocrinologists working with these cases that probably would be able to answer better. But because it is, if you go to these extreme cases, it can be complex. And fortunately for sports, though, it would be very seldom where we need to go into the extreme sort of investigations on the conditions they have. Typically, it's enough to determine whether they have, a male performance advantage, which would be more related to whether they have testicles that produce testosterone and whether they have receptors that can make use of that testosterone.
So very, very few people have a sex which is hard to determine. The vast majority of people, it can be easily determined from external observation.
Yes.
There's a very, very small proportion. I don't know what it is. It'll be a small fraction of 1%. Obviously, those people are important, and not suggesting that they're not. And from that very small fraction, from what you're saying, and I take your point that we're getting right to the edges of endocrinological knowledge here, but within that very small fraction of people who don't have an immediately easily determined sex, it sounds like probably a very small fraction of those can't have their sex determined from a non-invasive or relatively non-invasive assessment based on XY versus Y, XX chromosomes from, say, a saliva swab. Is that fair?
Because, that is fair. Yeah, I think. No. Yeah, I was just going. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Tommy.
I was just going to say that I do think if we were, for example, to implement again a cheek swab to determine XY chromosomes in sports, I still think that should be seen as a screening, and the very few XY cases that would come up in athletes who want to take part in women's sport, they would still need some more confirmation to determine why, because there are still, you can have complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, for example. It's a rare condition, but it can happen, and those I think you can make the argument that those athletes should be in female sport, even though they have XY chromosomes. So I see the chromosomes screening as a screen, but you still need to do something to sort of verify why does this athlete have XY chromosome, and does it confer advantage? Yeah.
That's interesting. So you're saying that you could have an athlete who is and again, we're talking very small numbers, but I want to come back to that actually. You could have an athlete who is XY, but if they had a heavy androgen insensitivity, in other words, here we're basically talking about their body doesn't respond to testosterone in the way we talked about earlier. You're saying it might be right for them to be in the female category. If I may, that's perhaps slightly surprising to me because they're XY, so to put it simply, they are male. Would it not be fair to argue that A, they may still have some advantages because it's not all about testosterone, and B, if they've got a low testosterone sensitivity, well, that's part of their physiology, like some people have slow twitch muscle fibers or a small lung capacity. Are they not are they not males who are unlikely to make it to the Olympics?
Yeah, I think that's, is a reasonable argument as well. And it would certainly be simpler in a way for sport if they would go by chromosomes alone. On the other hand, the reason for the female category is that we want to exclude male performance advantages. And if you don't have male typical performance advantages, you can also make the case that maybe they should be included. I have seen some of these XY complete androgen insensitive people appear. There's been some interviews in media, some images. Certainly, I don't think anyone can argue that they look anywhere near male typical. So you have that sort of social, we shouldn't base any sporting decisions based on stereotypes of how people look, obviously, but it's very clear that their body development is more female-like. There is no question about that.
Okay. Yeah. No, I hear that. I mean, I think of course, if it's slightly unfemale-like and slightly male-like, then on the average, that still gives them an advantage. They may not end up winning because they're not very advantageous males, and they'd be competing against super females, and so they'd probably kind of not end up winning the gold or something, I suppose. Just one caveat. I wanted to be clear that from what you said, and this was my impression as well, that not only are the number of people with not clearly determined sex very small, but out of those, the people that it's really hard to determine sort of their sex after post swab or something is even smaller than that. On the other hand, Olympic athletes are a very, very tiny minority of people, and they're highly elite. And so you've got very, very few people whose sex is hard to determine. But on the other hand, it's likely that the proportion of those people within the Olympic population is going to be higher than within the general population, because they have potentially advantages in sports. Do you see what I mean? So the number could be higher in the Olympics than is in the general population. So something that seems almost vanishingly small as an issue in terms of the number of people it affects becomes less than vanishingly small within the Olympic population. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it does seem to be true. There's been some reports, published reports on that as well, showing how disproportionately common in athletics, these 5 ARD cases, so the known case with Caster Semenya, for example, but also other athletes in track and field. So and that kind of and that condition has been determined to have a clear male performance advantage, male puberty. So that's some degree of evidence that they do have an advantage with that specific DSD.
Could you brief, because Caster Semenya, beg your pardon, is well known. I mean,
yes,
that athlete no longer, I think, competes. Could you just briefly explain what we know about that person's condition?
Yeah, so that condition has been very, very well examined, because the case went to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So obviously all the medical details of her condition was revealed, and there were experts testifying about the condition. So it's called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. It means that you lack this enzyme that converts testosterone to DHT. Now, DHT is important for the development of the external genitalia and also body hair, but it's not relevant for male typical development in terms of muscle mass gains, stature, etc. So what happens is that your male external genitalia doesn't come out properly as it would normally. So when you are born, you can be mistaken as a girl. Your testicles are internal, but during puberty, your testicles produce normal male levels of testosterone, and the muscles, etc., can make use of that testosterone. So some of these athletes have been raised as girls, not all of them, but the known cases in athletics, that has been the case, and some of them also take on a female gender identity. So that's an unfortunate situation where they have been in girls' sport all the time, and then they face, possible exclusion when this is discovered later.
Let's carry on with the case study. So now we can come sort of full circle, if you like, and come back to talk about the 2 boxers who very recently competed in the Olympics, and as I say, both of these boxers won gold. I don't think it was a foregone conclusion they were going to win gold. I don't know much about boxing, but I believe they had lost fights in the past. So they won gold, and that extra elevates the controversies, but it wasn't inevitable. I think they were going to win, from what I can tell. Now, their names, well, it depends how you pronounce them, but Binimani, I think, Khalif, and Lin Yu Ting. So they're in 2 different weight categories for female boxing. So they didn't compete with each other, and they won all their fights, sort of 4 fights or something in a row, to win golds. So looking at those, so perhaps my first question would be, are they, as far as you know, the most typical kind of biological example of unclear, not obviously determined sex? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So obviously an extra layer of complexity on these Olympic cases has been the fact that IOC have been in conflict with IBA, and many people mistrust the International Boxing Association. But what I would say is that if the information that has come out is true, then this seems to be with sort of reasonable assumption, seems to be similar cases like the known ones in athletics, because according to the International Boxing Association, these athletes have XY chromosomes. Now, there was also a coach of Khalif saying the other day that yes, he confirmed that yes, they did find out about the XY chromosomes last year. They did find out about high testosterone levels. And he also claimed that Khalif was now on testosterone suppression. So all of these facts together kind of indicates that these are athletes with XY chromosomes. They are biologically male because they have high testosterone levels as well as confirmed by the coach, and therefore male development. So this would not be these extreme cases where it's difficult to determine the sex. All the evidence, if it's accurate, that has come out is that these are male boxers that have differences of sex development.
So as they have been tested and have been found to have the XY sex chromosome, on top of that, they got high test. I'm slightly uncomfortable. I mean, again, this is not my area. I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea, which is not quite what you said, but just to be clear, I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea that high testosterone means male. I mean, put simply, females with high testosterone levels might be good boxers because they might be more aggressive and have bigger muscles, right?
Yes, but they will never. One important thing there is that females, you cannot have male levels of testosterone if you're female. That's important. Yeah.
Okay, just doesn't happen. There's such a gap between male
levels. There's no overlap. There's no overlap. Yeah.
Okay. So actually, so you would argue that it's a pretty good, okay, maybe not perfect, nothing's perfect, but a pretty good way of telling whether someone's male or female is whether they're in this range of testosterone or that range of testosterone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then and somebody might argue, oh, they got XY chromosome, but they've got very low testosterone levels, so they haven't had those male advantages, although we've discussed that there are other male advantages. But in fact, these boxers, maybe both of them, but certainly Khalif anyway, has both the XY chromosome and at least had elevated levels of testosterone. So it seems if that information is true, that arguably this is a fairly clear-cut case. Okay. Now, when the Boxing Federation, the IBF, is it International Boxing Federation? Okay, it sounds like they're a bit controversial and maybe they haven't done everything in a squeaky clean fashion. I don't know. But are you aware of what tests they will have done, or at least claim to have done, on these boxers in the past? Sorry, maybe you said, so they will have done a swab, I guess, and discovered XY sex chromosome and then taken a blood sample or something and high levels of testosterone. Okay, Right, and I'm going to check through a few more questions for you. Bear with me a second. So why is it, as far as you're aware, and I know you fielded this question quite a few times, so there's this clash between the International Boxing Federation and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. These two athletes competed, were actually very successful. Why would there be these different rules, about these two athletes competing for the IBF, and different rules coming from the IBF than coming from the IOC, when from what we know, it's clear, can we say that these two athletes are biological males, are males?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the history is that the IOC in 2021 took a huge 180-degree turn on this area in general. They released this framework for how sports federation can determine policy on this area. So that was the first step. They actually moved the formal responsibility to the international federations, governing each specific sport. Now, the framework is very loose. It doesn't say you should have this rule or this rule. So boxing, obviously, they have determined that, okay, there's a huge advantage of being male. There's also a safety concern. We need to have sex categories, and they in the eligibility criteria for boxing, they state that it's based on chromosomes. That's how they define men and women in boxing. But given this conflict between IBA and the IOC, at the Olympics now, the competition rule, I mean, the IOC have just frequently referred to these athletes as female in their passport. So it seems that the only eligibility criteria in boxing in the Olympics was based on passport, whereas if it had been governed by the Boxing Association, it would have been based on chromosomes. And whether these athletes had been swimmers, they would not have been able to compete in women's swimming either, because World Aquatics have rules also based on excluding male performance advantages. But it's very unfortunate that it can be this way, of course, that you're suspended the previous year in World Championships, and then you have different eligibility criteria, clearly not, in my opinion, protecting fair competition in the boxing event at the Olympics.
So is it the case that at the Olympics, in some sports, people could compete in the female category under some circumstances despite having XY, or because they had female as their sex, I think, or it depends on the passport. It might say sex, might say gender, but it says female in their passport. So in some Olympic sports, if it says female in their passport, they can compete in the female category. Whereas in other sports in the Olympics, if it says female in their passport, but they are determined to be male through a swab test of their sex chromosomes, they can't compete in the female categories. Is that so? There's very different guidelines for different sports within the IOC, within the Olympics.
Yeah, that's the case right now.
And the IOC haven't agreed this because they haven't got around to it yet for good or bad reasons? I mean, you would have thought that part of the point of having a committee that oversees all these sports is that there's some unification. There's a universal set of principles by which these sports are governed and run.
Yeah, so their argument is that they think that each individual sport are the best to determine what, how large are the sex advantages in this particular sport. How should we set eligibility criteria for this sport? So that's the IOC position right now. They have certainly changed. I mean, they stated in their previous 2015 guideline that fair competition is and remains the most important sporting objective. So they have really changed their sort of general position. I think they've been influenced by social winds and perhaps to some extent ideology as well, in my opinion, because this framework is, in my opinion, very loose and very poor, actually.
It almost seems that the sports where one might want to be most sensitive to male advantage are the ones that are at the moment within the Olympics least sensitive. I mean, boxing, I don't think there could be, off the top of my head, another sport in the Olympics. I mean, maybe judo or wrestling, but boxing's the ones where you try and punch people in the face, or at least that's a big part of it.
And rugby 7 maybe, I think, was included in the Olympics as well.
Indeed, and that's indeed, that's a very heavy duty sport. But nonetheless, there's something about boxing which is pugilistic. I mean, it's all about the fight. You would have thought they would be most sensitive to that, whereas it seems that they're more sensitive perhaps in some sports, I'm generalizing here, where, well, there's less of a health risk on the line.
Yeah.
It is surprising. Two more questions to finish with, talking about, the positive side of this, the inclusivity. Do you think there is a way, and the answer could be no, I don't think that's terrible or necessarily wrong. Do you think there is a way that in the future, let's say the Olympics, can enable everyone who is good enough to compete regardless of their physiological makeup? Or are we inevitably going to need to exclude, albeit a tiny number of people, nonetheless, these are human beings who are going to be affected in the pursuit of, let's say, protecting female sport?
Yeah, so I don't think there is any way to fully sort of reach the full inclusion and protect fair competition at the same time. And I don't think we should abandon the sex categories, because even if you go with performance categories, weight classes, etc., we still have males on average performing slightly better even when you control for body size, etc. So purely open competitions would disproportionately favor males, and that would be a huge step back, I think, in sports. So my very short answer is probably no. I don't think we can reach a solution to this where everyone is happy, everyone agrees. There is conflict between inclusion and fair competition, and there is no therapy treatment today that can remove male advantages completely. And it's probably unrealistic that we will ever see any therapy that can do that. So I just think sports need to admit and realize this as a kind of an uncomfortable reality, and go on with the task of setting appropriate eligibility criteria.
One more inclusivity question, sort of philosophical in a way. Coming back to the start of our discussion, you explained very clearly why we categorize by sex, sometimes categorize by age. Not in the Olympics, of course, it's about the best of the best, regardless of age, but outside of, those competitions, categorize by age, categorize by weight sometimes. Should we be categorizing by other factors? I mean, for example, basketball. Again, I don't know a lot about basketball, but being tall really seems to be advantageous for basketball. There are some human populations that are clearly taller than other human populations. I would imagine, and I'd love to be proved wrong, and I could well be, by the way, but I can imagine that for some, say, nations, it would be very hard for them to win at basketball because they're not that tall. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. Again, it could be that you can, but do you see what I mean? It seems like at least in principle, an example where should we have height categories for basketball? So we categorize by sex. Should we in basketball categorize by height to be more inclusive?
Yeah, it's a good question to think about. What I think is, being male is an advantage, is an advantage in almost every sport, like we said before. Being tall is obviously an advantage in basketball, but we also have this, genetic/natural selection in sports. So if you realize that if you finish last in the 60-meter school competition when you're 10 years old, you're probably not going to pursue sprinting events. You will probably find that you're more suited for other disciplines, other events. And it's the same with height in a way. Maybe basketball is not for you. Now, I'm not completely against having a category for short people in basketball. It will certainly be more inclusive to more people to play competitive basketball at higher levels. But on the other hand, it seems, even with a long history in basketball, they have not seen this as an important step. So I think it's fair for people to suggest that, maybe we need a category for this because it's such a big disadvantage. But on the other hand, not every sport is for everyone, and most people can find a sport that suits them. But so that's very different from the fact that if you're female instead of male, you have a disadvantage in almost every sport compared with males. So that there's a big important distinction there, I think.
No, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, and it's very well put, Tommy. Well, on that note, I'm going to say thank you so much for your time. That's been super interesting. I appreciate you letting me grill you on a lot of questions in great detail to a degree of pedanticness, which I was pushing my luck, but I think it's so important for this particular topic, and it's a contentious topic, but also a very interesting one that pulls in, elements of biology, society, culture, touches on the politics as well.